the claim that it is possible for a digital computer running a program to have a mind and consciousness, in the same sense that people do, simply by virtue of running the right program. According to Searle, when referring to a hypothetical computer program which can be told a story then answer questions about it, partisans of strong AI claim that in this question and answer sequence the machine is not only simulating a human ability, but also, 1. That the machine can literally be said to understand the story and provide the answers to questions, and 2. That what the machine and its program do explains the human ability to understand the story and answer questions about it. To contest this view, Searle writes in his first description of the argument, suppose that I'm locked in a room, and that I know no Chinese, either written or spoken. He further supposes that he has a set of rules in English that enable me to correlate one set of formal symbols with another set of formal symbols, that is, the Chinese characters. These rules allow him to respond, in written Chinese, to questions, also written in Chinese, in such a way that the posers of the questions, who do understand Chinese, are convinced that Searle can actually understand the Chinese conversation too, even though he cannot. Similarly, he argues that if there is a computer program that allows a computer to carry on an intelligent conversation in written Chinese, the computer executing the program would not understand the conversation either. The experiment is the centerpiece of Searle's Chinese room argument, which holds that a program cannot give a computer a mind understanding or consciousness regardless of how intelligently it may make it behave. The argument is directed against the philosophical positions of functionalism and computationalism, which hold that the mind may be viewed as an information processing system operating on formal symbols. Although it was originally presented in reaction to the statements of artificial intelligence researchers, it is not an argument against the goals of AI research, because it does not limit the amount of intelligence a machine can display. The argument applies only to digital computers, and does not apply to machines in general. This kind of argument against AI was described by John Haugland as the hollow shell argument. Searle's argument first appeared in his paper Minds, Brains, and Programs, published in Behavioral and Brain Sciences in 1980. It has been widely discussed in the years since. Chinese room thought experiment. If you can carry on an intelligent conversation with an unknown partner, does this imply that the unknown partner understands the conversation, has a mind, and experiences consciousness? Searle's thought experiment begins with this hypothetical premise. Suppose that artificial intelligence research has succeeded in constructing a computer that behaves as if it understands Chinese. It takes Chinese characters as input, and, by following the instructions of a computer program, produces other Chinese characters, which it presents as output. Suppose, says Searle, that this computer performs its task so convincingly that it comfortably passes the Turing test. It convinces a human Chinese speaker that the program is itself a live Chinese speaker. To all of the questions that the person asks, it makes appropriate responses, such that any Chinese speaker would be convinced that he is talking to another Chinese-speaking human being. The question Searle wants to answer is this: does the machine literally understand Chinese? Or is it merely simulating the ability to understand Chinese? B. Searle calls the first position strong AI, and the latter weak REC. Searle then supposes that he is in a closed room, and has a book with an English version of the computer program, along with sufficient paper, pencils, erasers, and filing cabinets. Searle could receive Chinese characters through a slot in the door, process them according to the program's instructions, and produce Chinese characters as output. If the computer had passed the Turing test this way, it follows, says Searle, that he would do so as well, simply by running the program manually. Searle asserts that there is no essential difference between the roles of the computer and himself in the experiment. Each simply follows a program, step by step, producing a behavior which is then interpreted as demonstrating intelligent conversation. However, Searle would not be able to understand the conversation. I don't speak a word of Chinese, he points out. Therefore, he argues, it follows that the computer would not be able to understand the conversation either. Searle argues that without understanding or intentionality we cannot describe what the machine is doing as thinking, and since it does not think, it does not have a mind in anything like the normal sense of the word. Therefore he concludes that strong I is false. History. Gottfried Leibniz made the similar argument in 1714, using the thought experiment of expanding the brain until it was the size of a mill. Leibniz found it difficult to imagine that a mind capable of perception could be constructed using only mechanical processes. In 1974, Lawrence Davis imagined duplicating the brain using telephone lines and offices staffed by people, and in 1978 Ned Block envisioned the entire population of China involved in such a brain simulation. This thought experiment is called the China brain, also the Chinese nation, or the Chinese gem. The Chinese room was introduced in Searle's 1980 paper Minds, Brains, and Programs published in Behavioral and Brain Sciences. It eventually became the journal's most influential target article, generating an enormous number of commentaries and responses in the ensuing decades. David Cole writes that the Chinese room argument has probably been the most widely discussed philosophical argument in cognitive science to appear in the past 25 years. Most of the discussion consists of attempts to refute it. The overwhelming majority, notes PBS editor Stephen Harnett, still think that the Chinese room argument is dead wrong. The sheer volume of the literature that has grown up around it inspired Pat Hayes to quit that the field of cognitive science ought to be redefined as the ongoing research program of showing Searle's Chinese room argument to be false. Searle's paper has become something of a classic in cognitive science, according to Harnett. Verlockman agrees, and has described his paper as an exemplar of philosophical clarity and purity. Philosophy. Although the Chinese room argument was originally presented in reaction to the statements of AI researchers, philosophers have come to view it as an important part of the philosophy of mind. It is a challenge to functionalism and the computational theory of mind, and is related to such questions as the mind-body problem, the problem of other minds, the symbol grounding problem, and the hard problem of consciousness. Strong I. Searle identified a philosophical position he calls strong I. The appropriately programmed computer with the right inputs and outputs would thereby have a mind in exactly the same sense human beings have minds. The definition hinges on the distinction between simulating a mind and actually having a mind. Searle writes that according to strong I, the correct simulation really is a mind. According to weak I, the correct simulation is a model of the mind. The position is implicit in some of the statements of early AI researchers and analysts. For example, in 1955, AI founder Herbert A. Simon declared that there are now in the world machines that think, that learn, and create, and claimed that they had solved the venerable mind-body problem, explaining how a system composed of matter can have the properties of mind. John Haugeland wrote that AI wants only the genuine article, machines with minds, in the full and literal sense. This is not science fiction, but real science, based on a theoretical conception as deep as it is daring. Namely, we are, at root, computers ourselves. Searle also ascribes the following positions to advocates of strong I. AI systems can be used to explain the mind. C. The study of the brain is irrelevant to the study of the mind. I, and the Turing test is adequate for establishing the existence of mental states. J. Strong I as computationalism or functionalism. In more recent presentations of the Chinese room argument, Searle has identified strong I as computer functionalism, a term he attributes to Daniel Dennett. Functionalism is a position in modern philosophy of mind that holds that we can define mental phenomena, such as beliefs, desires, and perceptions, by describing their functions in relation to each other and to the outside world. Because a computer program can accurately represent functional relationships as relationships between symbols, a computer can have mental phenomena if it runs the right program, according to functionalism. Stephen Harned argues that Searle's depictions of strong I can be reformulated as recognizable tenets of computationalism, a position, unlike strong I, that is actually held by many thinkers, and hence one worth refuting. Computationalism is the position in the philosophy of mind which argues that the mind can be accurately described as an information processing system. Each of the following, according to Harned, is a tenet of computationalism. Mental states are computational states, which is why computers can have mental states and help to explain the mind. Computational states are implementation independent. In other words, it is the software that determines the computational state, not the hardware, which is why the brain, being hardware, is irrelevant, and that, since implementation is unimportant, the only empirical data that matters is how the system functions, hence the Turing test is definitive, strong I versus biological naturalism. Searle holds a philosophical position he calls biological naturalism, that consciousness and understanding require specific biological machinery that is found in brains. He writes brains cause minds and that actual human mental phenomena are dependent on actual physical chemical properties of actual human brains. Searle argues that this machinery, known in neuroscience as the neural correlates of consciousness, must have some unspecified causal powers that permit the human experience of consciousness. Searle's faith in the existence of these powers has been criticized. Searle does not disagree that machines can have consciousness and understanding, because, as he writes, we are precisely such machines. Searle holds that the brain is, in fact, a machine, but the brain gives rise to consciousness and understanding using machinery that is non-computational. If neuroscience is able to isolate the mechanical process that gives rise to consciousness, then Searle grants that it may be possible to create machines that have consciousness and understanding. However, without the specific machinery required, Searle does not believe that consciousness can occur. Biological naturalism implies that one cannot determine if the experience of consciousness is occurring merely by examining how a system functions, because the specific machinery of the brain is essential. Thus, biological naturalism is directly opposed to both behaviorism and functionalism, including computer functionalism, or strong I. Biological naturalism is similar to identity theory, the position that mental states are identical to or composed of neurological events. However, Searle has specific technical objections to identity theory. Searle's biological naturalism and strong I are both opposed to Cartesian dualism, the classical idea that the brain and mind are made of different substances. Indeed, Searle accuses strong I of dualism, writing that strong I only makes sense given the dualistic assumption that, where the mind is concerned, the brain doesn't matter. Consciousness. Searle's original presentation emphasized understanding, that is, mental states, with what philosophers call intentionality, and did not directly address other closely related ideas such as consciousness. However, in more recent presentations, Searle has included consciousness as the real target of the argument. Computational models of consciousness are not sufficient by themselves for consciousness. The computational model for consciousness stands to consciousness in the same way the computational model of anything stands to the domain being modeled. Nobody supposes that the computational model of rainstorms in London will leave us all wet. But they make the mistake of supposing that the computational model of consciousness is somehow conscious. It is the same mistake in both cases. John R. Searle, Consciousness and Language, page 16. David Chalmers writes, it is fairly clear that consciousness is at the root of the matter of the Chinese room. Colin McGinn argues that the Chinese room provides strong evidence that the hard problem of consciousness is fundamentally insoluble. The argument, to be clear, is not about whether a machine can be conscious, but about whether it, or anything else for that matter, can be shown to be conscious. It is plain that any other method of probing the occupant of a Chinese room has the same difficulties in principle as exchanging questions and answers in Chinese. It is simply not possible to divine whether a conscious agency inhabits the room, or some clever simulation. Searle argues that this is only true for an observer outside of the room. The whole point of the thought experiment is to put someone inside the room where they can directly observe the operations of consciousness. Searle claims that from his vantage point, within the room there is nothing he can see that could imaginably give rise to consciousness other than himself, and clearly he does not have a mind that can speak Chinese. Computer science. The Chinese room argument is primarily an argument in the philosophy of mind, and both major computer scientists and artificial intelligence researchers consider it irrelevant to their fields. However, several concepts developed by computer scientists are essential to understanding the argument, including symbol processing, Turing machines, Turing completeness, and the Turing test. Strong AI versus AI research. Searle's arguments are not usually considered an issue for AI research. Stuart Russell and Peter Norvig observe that most AI researchers don't care about the strong AI hypothesis as long as the program works. They don't care whether you call it a simulation of intelligence or real intelligence. The primary mission of artificial intelligence research is only to create useful systems that act intelligently, and it does not matter if the intelligence is merely a simulation. Searle does not disagree that AI research can create machines that are capable of highly intelligent behavior. The Chinese room argument leaves open the possibility that a digital machine could be built that acts more intelligent than a person, but does not have a mind or intentionality in the same way that brains do. Indeed, Searle writes that the Chinese room argument assumes complete success on the part of artificial intelligence in simulating human cognition. Searle's strong AI should not be confused with strong AI, as defined by Ray Kurzweil and other futurists who use the term to describe machine intelligence that rivals or exceeds human intelligence. Kurzweil is concerned primarily with the amount of intelligence displayed by the machine, whereas Searle's argument sets no limit on this. Searle argues that even a super-intelligent machine would not necessarily have a mind and consciousness. Symbol processing. The Chinese room, and all modern computers, manipulate physical objects in order to carry out calculations and do simulations. AI researchers Alan Newell and Herbert A. Simon call this kind of machine a physical symbol system. It is also equivalent to the formal systems used in the field of mathematical logic. Searle emphasizes the fact that this kind of symbol manipulation is syntactic, borrowing a term from the study of grammar. The computer manipulates the symbols using a form of syntax rules without any knowledge of the symbol's semantics, that is, their meaning. Chinese room as a Turing machine. The Chinese room has a design analogous to that of a modern computer. It has a von Neumann architecture, which consists of a program, the book of instructions, some memory, the papers, and file cabinets, a CPU which follows the instructions, the man, and a means to write symbols in memory, the pencil and eraser. A machine with this design is known in theoretical computer science as Turing complete, because it has the necessary machinery to carry out any computation that a Turing machine can do, and therefore it is capable of doing a step-by-step simulation of any other digital machine, given enough memory and time. Alan Turing writes, all digital computers are in a sense equivalent. The widely accepted Church-Turing thesis holds that any function computable by an effective procedure is computable by a Turing machine. In other words, the Chinese room can do whatever any other digital computer can do, albeit much, much more slowly. There are some critics, such as Hanok Benyami, who argue that the Chinese room cannot simulate all the abilities of a digital computer, such as being able to determine the current time. Turing test. Turing test. The Turing test is a test of a machine's ability to exhibit intelligent behavior. In Alan Turing's original illustrative example, a human judge engages in a natural language conversation with a human and a machine designed to generate performance indistinguishable from that of a human being. All participants are separated from one another. If the judge cannot reliably tell the machine from the human, the machine is said to have passed the test. Complete argument. Searle has produced a more formal version of the argument of which the Chinese room forms a part. He presented the first version in 1984. The version given below is from 1990. And the only part of the argument which should be controversial is A3, and it is this point which the Chinese room thought experiment is intended to prove. He begins with 3 axioms. A1. Programs are formal, syntactic. A program uses syntax to manipulate symbols and pays no attention to the semantics of the symbols. It knows where to put the symbols and how to move them around, but it doesn't know what they stand for or what they mean. For the program, the symbols are just physical objects, like any others. A2. Minds have mental semantics. Unlike the symbols used by a program, our thoughts have meaning. They represent things, and we know what it is they represent. A3. Syntax by itself is neither constitutive of nor sufficient for semantics. This is what the Chinese room argument is intended to prove. The Chinese room has syntax because there is a man in there moving symbols around. The Chinese room has no semantics because, according to Searle, there is no one or nothing in the room that understands what the symbols mean. Therefore, having syntax is not enough to generate semantics. Searle posits that these lead directly to this conclusion. C1. Programs are neither constitutive of nor sufficient for minds. This should follow without controversy from the first 3. Programs don't have semantics. Programs have only syntax, and syntax is insufficient for semantics. Every mind has semantics. Therefore programs are not minds. This much of the argument is intended to show that artificial intelligence can never produce a machine with a mind by writing programs that manipulate symbols. The remainder of the argument addresses a different issue. Is the human brain running a program? In other words, is the computational theory of mind correct? He begins with an axiom that is intended to express the basic modern scientific consensus about brains and minds. A4. Brains cause minds. Searle claims that we can derive immediately and trivially that C2. Any other system capable of causing minds would have to have causal powers, at least equivalent to those of brains. Brains must have something that causes a mind to exist. Science has yet to determine exactly what it is, but it must exist because minds exist. Searle calls it causal powers. Causal powers is whatever the brain uses to create a mind. If anything else can cause a mind to exist, it must have equivalent causal powers. Equivalent causal powers is whatever else that could be used to make a mind. And from this he derives the further conclusions. C3. Any artifact that produced mental phenomena, any artificial brain, would have to be able to duplicate the specific causal powers of brains, and it could not do that just by running a formal program. This follows from C1 and C2, since no program can produce a mind, and equivalent causal powers produce minds, it follows that programs do not have equivalent causal powers. C4. The way that human brains actually produce mental phenomena cannot be solely by virtue of running a computer program. Since programs do not have equivalent causal powers produce minds, and brains produce minds, it follows that brains do not use programs to produce minds. Replies. Replies to Searle's argument may be classified according to what they claim to show. P. Those that identify who speaks Chinese. Those that demonstrate how meaningless symbols can become meaningful. Those that suggest that the Chinese room should be redesigned in some way. Those that contend that Searle's argument is misleading. Those that argue that the argument makes false assumptions about subjective conscious experience and therefore proves nothing. Some of the arguments, robot and brain simulation, for example, fall into multiple categories. System and virtual mind replies, finding the mind. These replies attempt to answer the question, since the man in the room doesn't speak Chinese, where is the mind that does? These replies address the key ontological issues of mind versus body and simulation versus reality. All of the replies that identify the mind in the room are versions of the system reply. System reply. Q. The basic system reply argues that it is the whole system that understands Chinese. While the man understands only English, when he is combined with the program, scratch paper, pencils, and file cabinets, they form a system that can understand Chinese. Here, understanding is not being ascribed to the mere individual, rather it is being ascribed to this whole system of which he is a part. Searle explains. The fact that man does not understand Chinese is irrelevant, because it is only the system, as a whole, that matters. Searle notes that, in this simple version of the system's reply, there is nothing more than a list of physical objects. It grants the power of understanding and consciousness to the conjunction of that person and bits of paper. Searle responds by simplifying the list of physical objects. He asks what happens if the man memorizes the rules and keeps track of everything in his head. Then the whole system consists of just one object, the man himself. Searle argues that if the man doesn't understand Chinese, then the system doesn't understand Chinese either, and the fact that the man appears to understand Chinese proves nothing. Critics of Searle's response argue that the program has allowed the man to have two minds in one head, who. More sophisticated versions of the system reply try to identify more precisely what the system is, and they differ in exactly how they describe it. According to these replies, the mind that speaks Chinese could be such things as the software a program running program, a simulation of the neural correlates of consciousness, the functional system, a simulated mind, an emergent property, or a virtual mind. Marvin Minsky's version of the system reply, described below. Virtual mind reply. The term virtual is used in computer science to describe an object that appears to exist in a computer or computer network only because software makes it appear to exist. The objects inside computers, including files, folders, and so on, are all virtual except for the computer's electronic components. Similarly, Minsky argues a computer may contain a mind that is virtual in the same sense as virtual machines, virtual communities, and virtual reality. To clarify the distinction between the simple systems reply given above and virtual mind reply, David Cole notes that two simulations could be running on one system at the same time, one speaking Chinese and one speaking Korean. While there is only one system, there can be multiple virtual minds, thus the system cannot be the mind. Searle responds that such a mind is, at best, a simulation, and writes, "No one supposes that computer simulations of a 5-alarm fire will burn the neighborhood down, or that a computer simulation of a rainstorm will leave us all drenched." Nicholas Fern responds that, for some things, simulation is as good as the real thing. When we call up the pocket calculator function on a desktop computer, the image of a pocket calculator appears on the screen. We don't complain that it isn't really a calculator, because the physical attributes of the device do not matter. The question is the human mind, like the pocket calculator, essentially composed of information? Or is the mind like the rainstorm, something other than a computer, and not realizable in full by a computer simulation? The issue of simulation is also discussed in the article Synthetic Intelligence. These replies provide an explanation of exactly who it is that understands Chinese. If there is something besides the man in the room that can understand Chinese, Searle can't argue that, 1. The man doesn't understand Chinese, therefore, 2. Nothing in the room understands Chinese. This, according to those who make this reply, shows that Searle's argument fails to prove that strong I is false. However, the replies, by themselves, do not prove that strong I is true, either. They provide no evidence that the system, or the virtual mind, understands Chinese, other than the hypothetical premise that it passes the Turing test. As Searle writes, the system's reply simply begs the question by insisting that system must understand Chinese. Robot and Semantics replies, finding the meaning. As far as the person in the room is concerned, the symbols are just meaningless squiggles. But if the Chinese room really understands what it is saying, then the symbols must get their meaning from somewhere. These arguments attempt to connect the symbols to the things they symbolize. These replies address Searle's concerns about intentionality, symbol grounding, and syntax, versus semantics. Robot reply. Suppose that instead of a room, the program was placed into a robot that could wander around and interact with its environment. This would allow a causal connection between the symbols and things they represent. Hans Moravec comments, if we could craft a robot to a reasoning program, we wouldn't need a person to provide the meaning anymore. It would come from the physical world. Searle's reply is to suppose that, unbeknownst to the individual in the Chinese room, some of the inputs came directly from a camera mounted on a robot, and some of the outputs were used to manipulate the arms and legs of the robot. Nevertheless, the person in the room is still just following the rules and does not know what the symbols mean. Searle writes he doesn't see what comes into the robot's eyes. See Mary's room for a similar thought experiment. Derived meaning. Some respond that the room, as Searle describes it, is connected to the world, through the Chinese speakers that it is talking to, and through the programmers who design the knowledge base in his file cabinet. The symbols Searle manipulates are already meaningful, they're just not meaningful to him. Searle says that the symbols only have a derived meaning. Like the meaning of words in books, the meaning of the symbols depends on the conscious understanding of the Chinese speakers and the programmers outside the room. The room, according to Searle, has no understanding of its own common sense knowledge/contextualist reply. Some have argued that the meanings of the symbols would come from a vast background of common sense knowledge encoded in the program and the filing cabinets. This would provide a context that would give the symbols their meaning. Searle agrees that this background exists, but he does not agree that it can be built into programs. Hubert Dreyfus has also criticized the idea that the background can be represented symbolically. To each of these suggestions, Searle's response is the same. No matter how much knowledge is written into the program, and no matter how the program is connected to the world, he is still in the room manipulating symbols according to rules. His actions are syntactic, and this can never explain to him what the symbols stand for. Searle writes syntax is insufficient for semantics. Why? However, for those who accept that Searle's actions simulate a mind separate from his own, the important question is not what the symbols mean to Searle, what is important is what they mean to the virtual mind. While Searle is trapped in the room, the virtual mind is not. It is connected to the outside world through the Chinese speakers it speaks to, through the programmers who gave it world knowledge, and through the cameras and other sensors that roboticists can supply. Brain simulation and connectionist replies, redesigning the room. These arguments are all versions of the system reply that identify a particular kind of system as being important. They identify some special technology that would create conscious understanding in a machine. Note that the robot and common sense knowledge replies above also specify a certain kind of system as being important. Brain simulator reply. Suppose that the program simulated in fine detail the action of every neuron in the brain of a Chinese speaker. This strengthens the intuition that there would be no significant difference between the operation of the program and the operation of a live human brain. Searle replies that such a simulation does not reproduce the important features of the brain, its causal and intentional states. Searle is adamant that human mental phenomena are dependent on actual physical chemical properties of actual human brains. Moreover, he argues, I imagine that instead of a monolingual man in a room shuffling symbols, we have the man operate an elaborate set of water pipes with valves connecting them. When the man receives the Chinese symbols, he looks up in the program, written in English, which valves he has to turn on and off. Each water connection corresponds to a synapse in the Chinese brain, and the whole system is rigged up so that after doing all the right firings, that is after turning on all the right faucets, the Chinese answers pop out at the output end of the series of pipes. Now where is the understanding in this system? It takes Chinese as input, it simulates the formal structure of the synapses of the Chinese brain, and it gives Chinese as output. But the man certainly doesn't understand Chinese, and neither do the water pipes, and if we are tempted to adopt what I think is the absurd view, that somehow the conjunction of man and water pipes understands, remember that in principle the man can internalize the formal structure of the water pipes, and do all the neuron firings in his imagination. Two variations on the brain simulator reply are: China brain. What if we ask each citizen of China to simulate one neuron, using the telephone system to simulate the connections between axons and dendrites? In this version, it seems obvious that no individual would have any understanding of what the brain might be saying. Brain replacement scenario. In this, we are asked to imagine that engineers have invented a tiny computer that simulates the action of an individual neuron. What would happen if we replaced one neuron at a time? Replacing one would clearly do nothing to change conscious awareness. Replacing all of them would create a digital computer that simulates a brain. If Searle is right, then conscious awareness must disappear during the procedure, either gradually or all at once. Searle's critics argue that there would be no point during the procedure when he can claim that conscious awareness ends and mindless simulation begins. Theseus. For a similar thought experiment, Connectionist replies. Add closely related to the brain simulator reply. This claims that a massively parallel connectionist architecture would be capable of understanding. Combination reply. This response combines the robot reply with a brain simulation reply, arguing that a brain simulation connected to the world through a robot body could have a mind. Many mansion/wait till next year reply. Better technology in the future will allow computers to understand. Searle agrees that this is possible, but considers this point irrelevant. His argument is that a machine using a program to manipulate formally defined elements can produce understanding. Searle's argument, if correct, rules out only this particular design. Searle agrees that there may be other designs that would cause a machine to have conscious understanding. These arguments, and the robot or common sense knowledge replies, identify some special technology that would help create conscious understanding in a machine. They may be interpreted in two ways. Either they claim, 1. This technology is required for consciousness, the Chinese room does not, or cannot implement this technology, and therefore the Chinese room cannot pass the Turing test, or, even if it did, it would not have conscious understanding. Or they may be claiming that, 2. It is easier to see that the Chinese room has a mind if we visualize this technology as being used to create it. In the first case, where features like a robot body, or a connectionist architecture are required, Searle claims that strong AI, as he understands it, has been abandoned if the Chinese room has all the elements of a Turing-complete machine, and thus is capable of simulating any digital computation whatsoever. If Searle's room can't pass the Turing test, then there is no other digital technology that could pass the Turing test. If Searle's room could pass the Turing test, but still does not have a mind, then the Turing test is not sufficient to determine if the room has a mind. Either way, it denies one or the other of the positions Searle thinks of as strong AI, proving his argument. The brain arguments in particular deny strong AI, if they assume that there is no simpler way to describe the mind than to create a program that is just as mysterious as the brain was. He writes, I thought the whole idea of strong AI was that we don't need to know how the brain works to know how the mind works. If computation does not provide an explanation of the human mind, then strong AI has failed, according to Searle. Other critics hold that the room as Searle described it does, in fact, have a mind. However, they argue that it is difficult to see Searle's description is correct, but misleading. By redesigning the room more realistically, they hope to make this more obvious. In this case, these arguments are being used as appeals to intuition, see next section. In fact, the room can just as easily be redesigned to weaken our intuitions. Ned Block's blockhead argument suggests that the program could, in theory, be rewritten into a simple lookup table of rules of the form, if the user writes S, reply with P and go to X. At least in principle, any program can be rewritten or refactored into this form, even a brain simulation. In the blockhead scenario, the entire mental state is hidden in the letter X, which represents a memory address and number associated with the next rule. It is hard to visualize that an instant of one's conscious experience can be captured in a single large number, yet this is exactly what strong I claims. On the other hand, such a lookup table would be ridiculously large, probably to the point of being impossible in practice, and the states could therefore be extremely specific. Searle argues that however the program is written, or however the machine is connected to the world, the mind is being simulated by a simple step-by-step digital machine, or machines. These machines are always just like the man in the room, they understand nothing, and don't speak Chinese. They are merely manipulating symbols without knowing what they mean. Searle writes, I can have any formal program you like, but I still understand nothing. The following arguments, and the intuitive interpretations of the arguments above, do not directly explain how a Chinese-speaking mind could exist in Searle's room, or how the symbols he manipulates could become meaningful. However, by raising doubts about Searle's intuitions they support other positions, such as the system and robot replies. These arguments, if accepted, prevent Searle from claiming that his conclusion is obvious by undermining the intuitions that his certainty requires. Several critics believe that Searle's argument relies entirely on intuitions. Ned Block writes Searle's argument depends for its force on intuitions that certain entities do not think. Daniel Dennett describes the Chinese room argument as a misleading intuition pump, and writes Searle's thought experiment depends, illicitly, on your imagining too simple a case, an irrelevant case, and drawing the obvious conclusion from it. Some of the arguments above also function as appeals to intuition, especially those that are intended to make it seem more plausible that the Chinese room contains a mind, which can include the robot, common sense knowledge, brain simulation, and connectionist replies. Several of the replies above also address the specific issue of complexity. The connectionist reply emphasizes that a working artificial intelligence system would have to be as complex and as interconnected as the human brain. The common sense knowledge reply emphasizes that any program that passed a Turing test would have to be an extraordinarily supple, sophisticated, and multilayered system, brimming with world knowledge, and meta-knowledge as Daniel Dennett explains. Speed and complexity replies. The speed at which human brains process information is, by some estimates, 100 billion operations per second. Several critics point out that the man in the room would probably take millions of years to respond to a simple question, and would require filing cabinets of astronomical proportions. This brings the clarity of Searle's intuition into doubt. An especially vivid version of the speed and complexity replies from Paul and Patricia Churchland. They propose this analogous thought experiment. Churchland's luminous room. 87. Consider a dark room containing a man holding a bar magnet, or charged object. If the man pumps the magnet up and down, then, according to Maxwell's theory of artificial luminance, it will initiate a spreading circle of electromagnetic waves, and will thus be luminous. But as all of us who have toyed with magnets, or charged balls well know, their forces, or any other forces for that matter, even when set in motion produce no luminance at all. It is inconceivable that you might constitute real luminance just by moving forces around. The problem is that he would have to wave the magnet up and down something like 450 trillion times per second in order to see anything. Stephen Harned is critical of speed and complexity replies when they stray beyond addressing our intuitions. He writes some have made a cult of speed and timing, holding that, when accelerated to the right speed, the computational may make a phase transition into the mental. It should be clear that is not a counter-argument, but merely an ad hoc speculation, as is the view that it is all just a matter of ratcheting up to the right degree of complexity. Searle accuses his critics of placing too much faith in their own intuitions. Searle argues that anyone who is willing to accept the system reply which asserts that a mind can emerge from a system without saying what the system is, or how such a thing might give rise to a mind, has been completely misled by their own intuitions, writing that they are under the grip of an ideology. Several replies argue that Searle's argument is irrelevant because his assumptions about the mind and consciousness are faulty. Searle believes that human beings directly experience their consciousness, intentionality, and the nature of the mind every day, and that this experience of consciousness is not open to question. He writes that we must presuppose the reality and knowability of the mental. These replies question whether Searle is justified in using his own experience of consciousness to determine that it is more than mechanical symbol processing. In particular, the other mind's reply argues that we cannot use our experience of consciousness to answer questions about other minds, even the mind of a computer, and the epiphenomenal reply argues that Searle's consciousness does not exist in the sense that Searle thinks it does. Other mind's reply. This reply points out that Searle's argument is a version of the problem of other minds applied to machines. There is no way we can determine if other people's subjective experience is the same as our own. We can only study their behavior, i.e., by giving them our own Turing test. Critics of Searle argue that he is holding the Chinese room to a higher standard than we would hold an ordinary person. Nils Nilsson writes, if a program behaves as if it were multiplying, most of us would say that it is, in fact, multiplying. For all I know, Searle may only be behaving as if he were thinking deeply about these matters. But, even though I disagree with him, his simulation is pretty good, so I'm willing to credit him with real thought. Alan Turing, writing 30 years before Searle presented his argument, noted that people never consider the problem of other minds when dealing with each other. He writes that instead of arguing continually over this point, it is usual to have a polite convention that everyone thinks. The Turing test simply extends this polite convention to machines. He doesn't intend to solve the problem of other minds for machines or people, and he doesn't think we need to AK. Searle disagrees with this analysis, and argues that the study of the mind starts with such facts as that humans have beliefs, while thermostats, telephones, and adding machines don't. What we wanted to know is what distinguishes the mind from thermostats and livers. He takes it as obvious that we can detect the presence of consciousness, and dismisses these replies as being off the point. Epiphenomenon/zombie reply. Several philosophers who argue that consciousness, as Searle describes it, does not exist. This position is sometimes referred to as eliminative materialism, the view that consciousness is a property that can be reduced to a strictly mechanical description, and that our experience of consciousness is, as Daniel Dennett describes it, a user illusion. Stuart Russell and Peter Norvig argue that, if we accept Searle's description of intentionality, consciousness, and the mind, we are forced to accept that consciousness is epiphenomenal, that it casts no shadow, that it is undetectable in the outside world. Searle believes that there are causal properties in our neurons that give rise to the mind. However, these causal properties can't be detected by anyone outside the mind, otherwise the Chinese room couldn't pass the Turing test. The people outside would be able to tell there wasn't a Chinese speaker in the room by detecting their causal properties. Since they can't detect causal properties, they can't detect the existence of the mental. Therefore, Russell and Norvig argue, Searle is mistaken about the knowability of the mental. Daniel Dennett provides this extension to the epiphenomena argument. Dennett's reply from natural selection. 101. Suppose that, by some mutation, a human being is born that does not have Searle's causal properties, but nevertheless acts exactly like a human being. This sort of animal is called a zombie in thought experiments in the philosophy of mind. This new animal would reproduce just as any other human, and eventually there would be more of these zombies. Natural selection would favor the zombies, since their design is, we could suppose, a bit simpler. Eventually the humans would die out. So therefore, if Searle is right, it is most likely that human beings, as we see them today, are actually zombies, who nevertheless insist they are conscious. However, this assumes that such a mutation is possible.